My name is Wallace. The company fired me 3 weeks before my pension vested, a transparent attempt to save a few $1,000s on my retirement package. They offered me a paltry severance, which I refused. Instead, I hired the most ruthless labor lawyer in the state. We didn't just sue for my lost pension. We filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of a dozen other older employees they'd downsized over the years. Yesterday, the judge certified our class action, and now the company isn't fighting to save a few thousand. They're fighting a $10 million lawsuit that threatens to bankrupt them. Before I tell you how we got here, how a simple, quiet man from engineering ended up holding the fuse to a corporate powder keg, do me a favor. Let me know in the comments if you've ever seen a company treat a loyal employee like a line item on a spreadsheet, something to be erased to make the quarterly numbers look good. And if you want to hear how this all plays out, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because this is a story about the real cost of forgetting where your value comes from. The day it happened started like any other Tuesday. I'd been at American Precision Dynamics for 29 years and 11 months. APD. The name had a certain weight to it, a promise of stability and quality that I'd helped build with my own two hands. I wasn't just an engineer. I was the director of Legacy Systems Integration, a title they invented for me because nobody else knew how the old machines talked to the new ones. I was the institutional memory of the place, the human bridge between the analog past and the digital future. My day began with the familiar scent of hot metal and industrial lubricant from the main floor, a smell I'd always found more comforting than coffee. The summons came at 10 in the morning. Not an email, not a call, but a crisp white envelope hand-delivered by a nervous-looking intern from Human Resources. My name, Wallace Miller, was typed on the front. Inside, a single sentence requested my presence in conference room 3. I knew that room. It was the one with no windows, the one they used for uncomfortable conversations. A knot, cold and heavy, formed in the pit of my stomach. I'd seen others get the white envelope. Good people. Experienced people. I walked through the office, my footsteps echoing in my own ears. I saw Marcus, my best young engineer, look up from his workstation with a question in his eyes. I gave him a small, tight nod that I hoped looked reassuring, but it felt like a lie. I'd mentored Marcus since he was a fresh-faced graduate, taught him everything I knew about the intricate dance of our production lines. He was the future of the department. I was beginning to suspect the past. Inside conference room 3, the air was stale and chilled. Bryce Calloway, our CEO of the last 2 years, sat at the head of the long, polished table. He was in his late 30s with a sharp suit, a sharper haircut, and the kind of unearned confidence that only a Wharton MBA can bestow. He was the founder's son-in-law, and he ran the company by spreadsheet, not by instinct. Next to him was Sheila from HR, a woman whose entire professional life seemed dedicated to avoiding eye contact. Bryce gestured to the empty chair opposite him. Wallace, thanks for coming in. He didn't sound thankful. He sounded like a man trying to get a root canal over with. I sat down. I placed my hands on the table. I kept my back straight. For nearly 30 years, I'd given this company my mind, my energy, and my loyalty. The least I could do was face its new master without flinching. As you know, Wallace, Bryce began, fiddling with a pen, we're in a period of significant operational realignment. We're looking to streamline our processes to create greater synergy moving forward. Synergy. It was his favorite word. He used it like a blunt instrument to justify every cut, every layoff. It meant nothing and everything. It meant he was about to ruin someone's life to save a fraction of a percentage point on the bottom line. Sheila slid a folder across the table. It stopped just short of my hands. I didn't touch it. The board has decided to eliminate certain redundancies in our operational structure, Bryce continued, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. Your role, Director of Legacy Systems Integration, has been identified as one of those redundancies. Redundancy. After 30 years, I was the only person on the planet with that role. I had designed half the systems he was talking about. Redundant. The word was an insult, a piece of corporate jargon meant to strip the humanity from the act. They weren't firing a man, they were eliminating a redundancy. I remained silent. My silence seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst would have. He expected shouting, pleading, maybe even tears. He didn't expect calm. Competence isn't cheap, and neither is composure. "So that's it?" I asked. My voice was even steady. "After 30 years, I'm a redundancy." Bryce finally met my eyes. I saw a flicker of something there. Not guilt, not empathy, annoyance. He was annoyed that I wasn't making this easy for him, that I wasn't just taking the hit and slinking away. "It's not personal, Wallace, it's just business." That was the line, the one they always use. It's the absolution they grant themselves. I leaned forward slightly. "My pension, Bryce. It vests in 3 weeks, on my 30-year anniversary." A muscle in his jaw twitched. This was the part he'd been dreading. "The company has prepared a generous severance package for you, in light of your service," Sheila murmured, nudging the folder again. I ignored her. I kept my eyes locked on Bryce. "You're firing me 21 days before I'm a vested, lifelong pensioner. That doesn't feel like business, Bryce. That feels personal. It feels calculated." He bristled. "Now, Wallace, let's not be dramatic. The timing is a coincidence." A coincidence. A 30-year career terminated with the precision of a surgeon's cut just before the finish line was a coincidence. I finally opened the folder. Inside was a single page, a severance offer that amounted to 2 months' pay. In exchange, I would have to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement, releasing the company from any and all future claims. It was an insult wrapped in legalese. They weren't offering me severance. They were trying to buy my silence for pennies on the dollar. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "No," I said. Bryce blinked. "No?" "No," I repeated. "I won't be signing that. The offer is insulting. And you can tell the board that this coincidence is going to be the most expensive one this company has ever had." I stood up. My chair made a soft scraping sound on the floor, the only sound in the room. I looked from Bryce's stunned face to Sheila's pale one. For the first time, I think they realized they had miscalculated. They mistook loyalty for weakness. They mistook quiet competence for passive acceptance. It was a common mistake for men like Bryce. It was also, in this case, a fatal one. I turned and walked out of the windowless room, leaving the door open behind me. And for the first time in 30 years, I didn't look back. The drive home was a blur. The familiar roads of the town I'd lived in my whole life felt alien, as if I were seeing them through someone else's eyes. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was immense, a heavy blanket that pressed in on me. It wasn't the angry, buzzing silence of rage. It was the cold, vast silence of a vacuum, the feeling of something essential having been ripped out of my life, leaving nothing behind. 30 years. I started at APD when I was 25, a young engineer with a head full of ideas and a belief in the simple contract of hard work for honest pay. I was married, with a son on the way. The company wasn't just a job, it was the foundation upon which I'd built my entire adult life. I pulled into my driveway and just sat in the car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. I looked at my house, the one I'd bought with my salary from APD, the one where I'd raised my family. Every brick, every shingle felt connected to that place I could no longer go. I got out of the car and walked past the front door, around the side of the house to my garage, my workshop. This was my sanctuary. The smell of sawdust and wood stain was the antidote to the sterile, metallic scent of the factory. Here I wasn't an engineer or a director. I was a craftsman. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn surface of my workbench. I'd built it myself from solid oak, a testament to patience and precision. All around me were my projects, a half-finished rocking chair for my granddaughter, a set of bookshelves for my wife, intricate birdhouses I sold at the local farmer's market. Here, things made sense. You took raw material, you applied skill and effort, and you created something of value, something that would last. What had I built at APD? I sank onto a stool, the cold of the concrete floor seeping through my shoes. I had built systems, complex interlocking systems of machinery and logistics that formed the company's backbone. I had solved problems that no one else could, staying up all night in the humming server rooms, tracing lines of code or schematics that only I understood. I had built relationships with suppliers and clients, relationships based on trust and a handshake, the old way. And I had built a team. I thought of Marcus, of the pride I felt watching him grow into a brilliant engineer in his own right. I had given them my life's work, and in return they had given me a white envelope and called me a redundancy. The hollowness began to fill, but not with rage. It was something colder, heavier. It was grief. The profound, disorienting grief of betrayal. I felt like a fool. A loyal, hard-working, dedicated fool. My mind started to drift back, a slideshow of slights and warnings I had ignored. I remembered old Mr. Abernathy, the founder, a tough but fair man who knew every employee by name. He'd walk the factory floor every morning, a thermos of coffee in his hand. He'd stop and talk, ask about your kids, remember that your wife had been sick. He once told me, "Wallace, a company is not its machines or its patents. It's its people. Never forget that." He'd sold the company to a larger conglomerate 10 years ago and retired to Florida. The conglomerate kept him on the board as a figurehead, but the soul of the place had left with him. Then came Bryce Calloway. He hadn't walked the floor. He flew in from corporate headquarters with a team of consultants. They didn't see people, they saw human capital resources. They didn't see experience, they saw legacy payroll liabilities. The language changed first. Meetings became ideation sessions. Problems became challenges. Firing people became right-sizing the organization. It was a slow, creeping poison, and I had watched it happen. This was the part that gnawed at me now, sitting in the quiet of my garage. This was the debatable logic of my own life. I was not a victim who had been blindsided. I was a witness who had chosen to look away. I remembered Frank Peterman from accounting, a numbers wizard, knew the books inside and out. 2 years ago they'd offered him an early retirement package. It was generous enough that he couldn't refuse, but we all knew the truth. He was a year away from his own pension milestone, the one that would have significantly increased his monthly payout. He was 58, he was too expensive. I'd shaken his hand at his retirement party, listened to Bryce give a flowery speech about his years of service, and I'd felt a prickle of unease. But I'd done nothing. I'd told myself Frank was happy to retire, that it was his choice. I didn't want to see the truth. Then there was Maria Flores from logistics, 25 years at APD. She ran the shipping department like a finely tuned watch. Nothing was ever late, nothing was ever lost. Last year, they brought in a new software suite, a streamlined logistics solution. It was a disaster, a clunky, ill-fitting system that caused more problems than it solved. Maria fought it, tried to explain that her manual, experience-based system was more efficient. They said she was resistant to change. They downsized her department and eliminated her position. They kept a junior manager who knew how to use the new software but had no idea how our clients actually worked. I saw Maria a few months later at the grocery store. She looked tired. She told me she was working part-time at a garden center to make ends meet. I'd expressed my sympathy. I told her the company was making a mistake, and then I went back to work. Why? I asked myself now, the question echoing in the silent workshop. Why did I stay silent? Was it fear? The fear of a man in his late 50s with a mortgage and a family, knowing that finding another job at my age would be nearly impossible. Yes, that was part of it. But it was more than that. It was a deep-seated, almost pathological loyalty, a company man mentality that had been drilled into me since my first day. You don't rock the boat, you do your job. You trust that the company will take care of you. It was the promise of my father's generation, a promise that felt as solid and real as the oak of my workbench, and I had clung to that promise even as I watched the company break it again and again. I believed my own value, my own irreplaceability, made me immune. I was the guy who kept the lights on. They wouldn't dare touch me. What a profound and arrogant miscalculation that had been. The door from the kitchen into the garage opened, spilling warm light into the dusty air. My wife Eleanor stood there. She'd been my rock for 40 years, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who saw the world with a clarity I often lacked. She held a steaming mug in her hand. She didn't say anything, just walked over and handed it to me. Hot tea, just the way I liked it. She looked around the workshop, at the tools hanging neatly on the pegboard walls, at the stacks of seasoned lumber. "You always come out here when the world gets too loud," she said softly. I took a sip of the tea. The warmth spread through my chest, but it couldn't touch the ice within. "They fired me, Ellie." She didn't look surprised, she just nodded, her lips a thin, hard line. "I figured as much when you came home 3 hours early and didn't say a word." She pulled up another stool and sat opposite me, her knees almost touching mine. "What did they say?" I recounted the meeting, the sterile room, Bryce's buzzwords, the insult of the severance offer. I told her about the pension, the 21 days. As I spoke, I saw her quiet sorrow harden into a sharp, brilliant anger. It was an anger on my behalf, purer and more potent than my own. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she reached out and took my hand. Her hand was warm and strong. "They didn't just fire you, Wallace," she said, her voice low and fierce. "They stole from us, from this family, from the future we planned. That pension wasn't a gift, it was deferred payment for 30 years of your life. And that little weasel Bryce thinks he can just snatch it away." Her words were a catalyst. She reframed the entire event. This wasn't a personal slight I had to grieve. It wasn't about my hurt feelings or my foolish loyalty. It was a theft, a calculated, deliberate act of financial violence against my family. The cold grief inside me began to burn. The hollow feeling was replaced by a hard, dense core of resolve. Eleanor was right. This wasn't an ending. It was a declaration of war. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I'm not going to let them get away with it." As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, a text message from Marcus. I opened it. It read, "Are you okay? It's chaos here. Kevin is asking where the cloud button is for the primary server schematics. I'm not joking." Kevin was Bryce's nephew, a 24-year-old with a degree in marketing who they'd brought in a few months ago as my new departmental liaison. It was obvious they were grooming him to be my replacement. The cloud button. He was looking for a magical button to access 3 decades of complex, custom-built system architecture that existed mostly on paper schematics locked in a fireproof cabinet to which only I, and now nobody, had the key. I showed the message to Eleanor. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "They have no idea what they've done, do they?" I looked at the text message again, at the absurd, comical incompetence it represented. And for the first time since I'd received that white envelope, I smiled too. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed a weapon. They thought they had eliminated a redundancy. What they had actually done was remove the one pin that was holding their entire creaking, corroded machine together, and it was about to fall apart. My resolve was no longer just a feeling, it was a plan. The first days after the firing were a strange mix of aimless quiet and furious purpose. The quiet came from the disruption of routine. For 30 years my body had been conditioned to a 5 a.m. wake-up, a quick breakfast, and the drive to the plant. Now the sun would rise and I'd still be in my kitchen, nursing a cup of tea. The silence of the house, a stark contrast to the familiar roar of the factory floor. But beneath that quiet surface, a new machine was whirring to life. My mind, which had been dedicated for so long to solving APD's problems, was now singularly focused on creating a new one for them. My plan didn't start with a lawyer. It started in my workshop with a stack of fresh legal pads and a newly sharpened pencil. They had underestimated me, and that was my greatest asset. But I couldn't let my own anger cause me to underestimate them. Bryce Calloway was arrogant and incompetent, but he was backed by a conglomerate with a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. A single lawsuit for wrongful termination, my word against theirs, would be a long, expensive, and uncertain battle. They'd claim my position was genuinely eliminated. They'd drown me in paperwork and legal fees until I gave up. No, a frontal assault was foolish. I needed to build a siege engine. My foresight, as it turned out, wasn't some grand secret strategy I'd been hatching for years. It was simply the byproduct of being a meticulous, perhaps even obsessive engineer. In my office, I had a filing cabinet full of my old work journals. For 30 years, I had kept a detailed handwritten log of every major project, every design decision, every system I built or repaired. These weren't company property, they were my personal notes, my professional diary. I had packed them up along with my family photos and my favorite coffee mug on that final day. I now spread them across my workbench. They were a Rosetta Stone for the inner workings of American precision dynamics. Page after page of schematics, contact information for obscure part suppliers, notes on the delicate handshake agreements I'd made with clients to work around the limitations of our own hardware. This was my leverage, not because it was secret, but because it was complex. It was a map of the territory, and I was the only one who could read it. But even this wasn't enough. I needed more than just a map. I needed an army. I thought back to Frank Peterman and Maria Flores. I thought of a half-dozen other names, veterans of the company who had been quietly retired or downsized over the last few years under Bryce's reign. I remembered the hushed conversations in the break room, the sad, perfunctory farewell parties. A pattern. Bryce hadn't just fired me. He'd been systematically culling the company's most experienced and therefore most expensive employees. He was asset stripping the human capital of the company. That wasn't just a coincidence. It was a strategy, and it was illegal. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act was more than just a law on the books. It was about to become a very sharp sword. This was the core of the plan. This wouldn't be just my fight, it would be our fight. I opened a new legal pad. At the top I wrote the APD dozen. My first call was to Frank. I found his number online. He was running a small tax preparation service out of a storefront in the next town over. When he answered, his voice was wary. "Wallace Miller, I'll be damned. What can I do for you?" "Frank, I have a question for you," I said, getting straight to the point. "When they offered you that early retirement package, did you feel like you had a choice?" "When they offered you that early retirement package, did you feel like you had a choice?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a calculator clacking. "That's a hell of a question, Wallace," he finally said, his voice dropping. "My wife and we talked about it. It wasn't what we had planned, but they made it clear my skill set was becoming obsolete." That's the phrase they used, obsolete. After 35 years. "They told me I was a redundancy," I said, 3 weeks before my pension vested. Another silence, this one shorter, sharper. "Those sons of bitches," he whispered. "They finally came for you too, huh?" "I'm sorry, Wallace. I really am." "Don't be sorry, Frank. Be angry," I said. "I'm putting something together, a way to fight back, but I can't do it alone." I explained my idea, not just a lawsuit, but a class action, a unified front of all the older employees they had pushed out. I told him I was willing to fund the initial legal costs myself. He was hesitant. He had a small business now, a quiet life. He didn't want the trouble. "Wallace, I signed papers, a non-disclosure. I took their money." "So did everyone, Frank," I argued. "They count on that. They isolate us, make us feel like we have no choice, and buy our silence. But a lawyer I've been researching says that if we can prove a pattern of discrimination, those agreements might not be worth the paper they're printed on, especially if they were signed under duress." This was the plausible inaccuracy I was banking on, something a good lawyer could argue. The idea that a severance agreement could be invalidated felt like a powerful hook. I let him think about it. "Just meet me for coffee, Frank. Hear me out. That's all I ask." He agreed. My next call was to Maria Flores. I found her at the garden center, her hands covered in dirt, a wide-brimmed sun hat on her head. She looked happier than the last time I'd seen her, but her eyes still held a shadow of that same wariness. I told her the same story. When I mentioned Frank's name, her eyes lit up with a spark of recognition. "Frank Peterman. They did the same thing to him. And what about Sam from maintenance? And Carol from purchasing?" She started listing names, people I hadn't even thought of. She had seen the pattern too from her vantage point in logistics, where she saw the personnel changes firsthand. She was a natural organizer. She hadn't just been downsized, she had been paying attention. She didn't need any convincing. She was in. "What do you need, Wallace?" she asked, wiping her earthy hands on her apron. "I've got phone numbers for at least 4 more people right here in my phone." The APD dozen was starting to assemble. Over the next week, my life became a series of clandestine meetings in coffee shops, diners, and public parks. Each person I met had a similar story. They were always a year or two away from a significant benefits cliff. They were always replaced by someone younger, cheaper, and less experienced. They were always told their role was being eliminated or that their skills were outdated, and they had all signed the same boilerplate severance agreement, feeling trapped and isolated. As I listened to their stories, my personal grievance transformed into a collective righteous cause. I wasn't just fighting for my pension anymore. I was fighting for Frank's dignity, for Maria's security, for the simple principle that you don't throw people away after a lifetime of service. With the stories of 10 other former employees documented in my legal pads, it was time to hire the lawyer. I had spent days researching, looking for more than just a competent attorney. I needed a predator. I found her in the city's top legal directory, Evelyn Reed. Her firm's website was minimalist and intimidating. Her biography was short, listing a string of high-profile, high-value victories against major corporations. Her nickname, according to online legal forums, was the Shark. Her office was on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper, a world of glass and steel and quiet, expensive carpeting. Ms. Reed herself was sharp and severe, with a gaze that seemed to take my entire measure in a single unblinking assessment. She wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit and listened without interruption as I laid out my story. I didn't just give her my own tale of woe. I opened my notebooks. I walked her through the pattern, name by name, date by date. I showed her the proximity of each termination to a pension or benefits milestone. I gave her the whole ugly picture. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "It's a compelling narrative, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice cool and precise. "But a narrative isn't a case. They'll claim every one of these was a legitimate business decision. You're alleging a conspiracy, a pattern of deliberate systemic age discrimination. That is incredibly difficult to prove." "But it's the truth," I said simply. "The truth is often irrelevant in a courtroom," she countered. "Evidence is what matters. You have your journals, which are helpful. You have the anecdotal stories of these other individuals, which are a good start. But we need more. We need data, payroll records, HR files, internal emails, things they will fight tooth and nail to avoid handing over." "So what do we do?" I asked. She smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "We sue them. We don't file a small claim for your pension. We file a major class action lawsuit on behalf of you and these 11 other John and Jane Does. We allege a pattern and practice of age discrimination. The filing itself will be a shot across their bow. Then we use the legal discovery process to demand the very evidence we need to prove our case. We turn their own bureaucracy against them." She explained the costs, the risks, the timeline. It was a massive gamble. I would have to put up a significant portion of my savings as a retainer. If we lost, I would be ruined. But if we won, it wouldn't just be about money. It would be about justice. I looked at her, this formidable woman who commanded millions with her intellect and her will. And the severance agreements, the NDAs they all signed. "We'll argue they were signed under economic duress as part of the very discriminatory scheme we're alleging," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's a hurdle, not a wall. If a judge sees a clear pattern of a company targeting older workers and then buying their silence for a pittance, they tend to take a very dim view of the validity of those agreements. It's a debatable point of law, and I enjoy a good debate." There it was, the calculated risk. The hidden leverage wasn't just my knowledge or the stories of the others. It was the legal machinery itself. By filing a class action, we weren't just asking for money. We were asking for access. We were asking for the keys to their kingdom, their filing cabinets, their servers. and the collective knowledge of the APD dozen would be our guide. Frank knew the accounting systems. Maria knew the HR personnel files. I knew the technical infrastructure. Together we could tell Miss Reed exactly what to ask for, where to look, and which rocks to turn over. They weren't just fighting one disgruntled engineer. They were fighting their own history. I pushed a check across her desk. The retainer. It was the biggest check I had ever written in my life. "Let's go to war, Ms. Reed." She took the check, her expression unchanging. "Bryce Calloway," she said, almost to herself. "I've heard of him. New money, old school arrogance. This will be interesting." The opening salvo was not a quiet affair. Evelyn Reed believed in shock and awe. She didn't send a polite letter of intent. She filed the $10 million class action lawsuit in federal court and had a process server walk it right into the lobby of APD's corporate headquarters and hand it to the receptionist. The lawsuit, a document thick as a phone book, named me, Wallace Miller, as the lead plaintiff on behalf of myself and 11 unnamed John and Jane Does. The charge was not wrongful termination. It was a violation of the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, alleging a multi-year systemic pattern of targeting and removing older workers to cut costs. The demand wasn't just for lost pensions and wages, it was for punitive damages. It was a declaration that we weren't just seeking compensation, we were seeking punishment. The silence from APD was immediate and absolute, but silence in the corporate world is never empty. It's loud. It's the sound of klaxons going off in the legal department, of frantic, high-level meetings being called, of a carefully constructed reality beginning to fracture. My inside source for the sound of that fracturing was Marcus. He called me the evening the lawsuit was served. He sounded stressed. "Wallace, what did you do?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "The whole executive floor is locked down. The company lawyers are here." I saw Bryce Calloway storming out of his office. His face was the color of a tomato. "I did what I had to do, Marcus," I said calmly, "for me and for the others they threw away." "I get it," he said quickly. "I do. Just be careful. They're panicking, and panicking people do stupid things." Marcus became my periscope. He was a loyal kid, but he was also a good engineer, and he was disgusted by the incompetence that had taken over. He fed me a steady stream of updates, little vignettes of the chaos unfolding within the walls of my former professional home. A week after the filing, Bryce called an all-hands meeting in the company cafeteria. According to Marcus, he stood on a small makeshift stage, a microphone in his hand, and tried to project an aura of calm control. He dismissed the lawsuit as a frivolous and vindictive action by a single disgruntled former employee. He said the company would fight it vigorously and that it would not be a distraction from their mission of driving forward with innovation and synergy. Marcus said you could have heard a pin drop. No one was buying it. The fear was palpable. The older employees, the ones who were left, looked at each other with knowing, worried glances. The younger ones just looked confused. The foundation of trust in the company, already eroded, had just been dynamited. Then the real problems started, the ones that had nothing to do with lawyers and everything to do with the gaping hole of experience that Bryce had created. Kevin, Bryce's nephew and my replacement, was at the center of the storm. He was a perfect example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, so blissfully unaware of his own incompetence that he was a danger to himself and everyone around him. His first major blunder was with the quarterly maintenance cycle for the automated stamping presses on Line 3. It was a complex procedure I had developed over years, a delicate balance of software patches and physical calibrations that had to be done in a precise sequence. I had left detailed manuals, of course, but the manuals were a guide, not a substitute for experience. Kevin, in his infinite wisdom, decided the procedure was inefficient. He tried to streamline it by skipping a few steps he deemed unnecessary. The result, as Marcus described it to me over the phone, was catastrophic. One of the primary presses, a $2 million piece of German engineering, seized up. A calibration error caused a die to misalign by less than a millimeter, but at that pressure, a millimeter was a mile. It sheared a critical gearing mechanism, filling the factory floor with the smell of burning oil and the sickening sound of grinding metal. The entire line went down. It was the most profitable production line in the entire plant. Panic ensued. Bryce brought in a team from the manufacturer in Germany at a cost of thousands of dollars a day just for them to fly in and assess the damage. Their verdict: the press would be down for at least 6 weeks pending the fabrication of a custom replacement part. The company's biggest client, an automotive firm whose entire supply chain depended on the components from that line, was furious. While the operational side was melting down, Evelyn Reed was turning the legal screws. She filed her first wave of discovery requests. They were a masterpiece of strategic precision. Guided by the collective memory of the APD dozen, she didn't just ask for all HR records. She asked for the personnel file of every employee over the age of 50 terminated in the last 5 years. She asked for the complete email history of Bryce Calloway and Sheila from HR, containing keywords like restructuring, right-sizing, severance, pension, and retirement. She asked for the digital archives of the payroll system, specifically seeking data that would correlate salary levels and age with termination dates. Frank Peterman, my accounting ally, had told me about a specific server in the basement, an older machine they used for archiving payroll data before they switched to a new system 3 years ago. He was sure they'd forgotten about it. We gave that information to Evelyn. She specifically requested all data from server SRV ACCNT04B, serial number 774B3C1. According to Marcus, this specific request sent the IT and legal departments into a frenzy. They couldn't claim the data didn't exist when we had provided the server's serial number. They tried to stall, of course. Their lawyers filed motions to block the requests as overly broad and burdensome. Evelyn fired back with counter motions, accusing them of obstruction and discovery abuse. The paper war was escalating, and every motion they filed cost them money and made them look guiltier. The pressure was building on Bryce from all sides. Clients were complaining about production delays. The board was demanding answers about the spiraling legal fees and the cost of the broken press. The atmosphere in the company, Marcus said, had turned toxic. It was a culture of blame and fear. Departments were hoarding information, refusing to cooperate with each other. The synergy Bryce was so fond of talking about had curdled into open hostility. The true moment of panic, however, came from an unexpected direction. Maria Flores, our logistics expert, had maintained a close personal relationship with the head of procurement at our second largest client, a medical device company. They weren't just business associates, their kids had played on the same soccer team. When Maria was downsized, she had called him to let him know. Now, with the lawsuit public, he called her. He was concerned. He told her their latest shipments from APD had been a mess. Wrong parts, incorrect counts, delayed deliveries. The quality and reliability that had been the hallmark of their relationship with APD were gone. He trusted Maria, not APD. Maria passed this information on to me, and I passed it to Evelyn. Evelyn's response was swift. She filed a motion to depose the head of procurement from that client company as a material witness. This was a devastating move. It took the fight outside the walls of APD and threatened to damage their client relationships directly. The thought of their biggest customers being dragged into a lawsuit to testify about their declining service was Bryce's worst nightmare. The takeover was happening, just as planned. And it was silent. We weren't hacking their systems or poaching their clients. We were just standing back and letting the vacuum of our collective competence do the work. The company wasn't being attacked, it was collapsing under the weight of its own bad decisions. Every day, Marcus would report a new fire that Kevin or one of the other junior managers had started. They had mistaken the map for the territory, and now they were hopelessly lost in the wilderness we had left behind. They were beginning to understand that competence isn't cheap, but losing it can bankrupt you. The turning point, the moment the ground truly shifted beneath APD's feet, wasn't a dramatic courtroom confrontation. It was a quiet procedural ruling delivered by a federal judge in a wood-paneled chamber. Evelyn called me on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice was as calm as ever, but I could detect a sliver of something that sounded like satisfaction. "Wallace," she said, "the judge has certified our class action." I sat down heavily in the chair in my workshop. Certified. The word was a legal thunderclap. It meant the judge had reviewed our preliminary evidence, the pattern of terminations, the proximity to benefit cliffs, the statistical data, and had officially agreed that we were not just a dozen individuals with separate grievances. We were a single unified class of plaintiffs who had allegedly suffered the same harm. The case of Miller et al. For American Precision Dynamics was now official. The company wasn't fighting me anymore. They were fighting all of us. And the potential liability wasn't just my pension. It was the combined lost wages, benefits, and punitive damages for 12 senior employees, a number that Evelyn had calculated to be well north of $10 million. The news hit the local business journal the next morning. It was a small article, buried on page 3, but in the tight-knit world of regional manufacturing, it was an earthquake. Suddenly, the frivolous lawsuit that Bryce had dismissed was a credible existential threat. The first crack in the dam was Marcus. He emailed me his resignation letter before he even submitted it to HR. It was short and professional. He thanked the company for the opportunity, but stated that he could no longer work in an environment that he felt compromised his professional and ethical standards. He didn't have another job lined up. He was quitting on principle. I called him immediately. "You sure about this, son?" I asked. "It's a big leap." "I'm sure, Wallace," he said, his voice firm with a newfound conviction. "I watched you build that department. I watched you treat people with respect. What's happening there now? It's not engineering. It's just damage control. I'd rather be unemployed than be a part of it." His departure sent a shockwave through the engineering department. He was their rising star, the one person who had a prayer of figuring out the mess I'd left behind. 2 days later, 2 other senior engineers, both men I had personally mentored for over a decade, also quit. They walked into Bryce's office together and handed him their resignation. The company's remaining institutional knowledge was walking out the door, not because I was poaching them, but because the rot had become unbearable. The exodus of talent was the blood in the water. The power had shifted. We were no longer the plaintiffs begging for scraps. We were the besieging army, and the walls of their fortress were crumbling from within. That's when my phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. I almost didn't answer it, but a hunch told me to pick it up. "Hello?" "Wallace, it's Bryce. Bryce Calloway." His voice was strained, stripped of its usual arrogant confidence. It was the voice of a man who was out of his depth and drowning. He had bypassed the lawyers, a desperate, foolish move. "Bryce," I said, my voice neutral, "you should be speaking with my attorney." "To hell with the attorneys, Wallace," he snapped, a flicker of his old self returning. "They're the ones who got us into this mess. Can we just talk, man to man? Let's be reasonable." Reasonable. After firing me 3 weeks before my pension, after calling me a redundancy, after dismissing our claim as frivolous, he now wanted to be reasonable. I said nothing, letting the silence hang on the line. "Look," he said, his tone shifting to one of strained conciliation, "there's been a misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication. I've spoken to the board. We're prepared to make you whole on the pension, every last dime. And we'd like to offer you a very generous consulting contract to help us through this transition period." The offer was breathtaking in its audacity. He wanted to buy me off. He wanted me to abandon the other 11 members of the class, take my money, and come back to fix the mess he had created. He thought my integrity was for sale. He still didn't understand who he was dealing with. "All communication needs to go through my lawyer, Bryce," I said again, my voice as cold and hard as steel. The fake friendliness in his voice evaporated, replaced by raw, panicked anger. "What is it you want, Wallace? Is this what you wanted, to destroy the company? To put hundreds of people out of work just to settle some personal score?" I almost laughed. The blame, the deflection, it was the classic narcissist prayer. It wasn't his fault for causing the problem, it was my fault for pointing it out. "Let me be very clear, Bryce," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You are confusing destruction with consequences. You made a business decision. You looked at my 30 years of service and my pension, and you made a calculation that it was cheaper to get rid of me. This lawsuit, the people quitting, the clients leaving, This isn't a personal score. This is the result of your calculation. This is the cost of doing business the way you do it. You just misjudged the price." He was sputtering, now a string of incoherent threats and pleas. "There has to be something. What do you want? Tell me what you want. Your old job back? A vice presidency? You can name your price." It was the ultimate desperate gambit. The very things they had denied me, the respect and position I had earned, were now being thrown at my feet like spare change. He thought he could buy my forgiveness. But it was never just about me. "I want what the judge says we're owed," I said, the words falling like ice chips into the phone. "All of us." I hung up the phone. I didn't slam it down. I just gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. The power shift was complete. He had lost control of the narrative, of his company, and of his own future. We weren't asking for a seat at the table anymore. We owned the table. The final confrontation wasn't a dramatic showdown in a boardroom. It was a court-ordered settlement conference in a sterile, neutral meeting room downtown. The air was thick with the expensive cologne of lawyers and the stench of desperation. I was there, along with Evelyn Reed, Frank Peterman, and Maria Flores. We were the representatives of the APD dozen. Across the long table sat Bryce Calloway, looking like a ghost in one of his sharp suits. He was flanked by a team of lawyers from a big national firm. The local lawyers were clearly out of their depth. Bryce wouldn't look at us. He just stared at a knot in the wood grain of the table as if it held the secrets to the universe. The company was bleeding. We knew it from our own sources, and we knew it from the discovery documents we had forced them to produce. The shutdown of Line 3 had cost them millions in lost orders and penalty clauses. Their second largest client had officially put their contract on hold pending the outcome of our lawsuit. Their stock, for the publicly traded conglomerate that owned them, had taken a hit. A trial was a risk they could not afford. A public trial where a jury would hear the stories of a dozen loyal, gray-haired employees being cast aside by a young, arrogant CEO would be a public relations disaster. They had to settle. The only question was the price. Their lead lawyer, a man with silver hair and a condescending smile, slid a folder across the table. "Our first offer," he said, as if bestowing a great gift. Evelyn didn't even open it. "Rejected," she said, her voice flat. The lawyer's smile faltered. "You haven't even looked at it." "I don't need to," Evelyn replied. "I know your company's financials better than you do right now. I know what this is costing you per day, and I know you don't want Mr. Calloway's emails read aloud to a jury. Let's not waste time with insults. Present a serious offer." The dance went on for hours. They would make an offer, and Evelyn would reject it with a one-word answer or a flick of her wrist. Frank would occasionally lean over and whisper something to her, pointing to a figure on a spreadsheet he'd brought. Maria would just sit there, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed on Bryce with a look of such profound disappointment that it seemed to burn a hole in him. I remained silent, a symbol of the problem they couldn't solve. I was the ghost of their past decisions, sitting right there at the table. Finally, after their fourth rejected offer, their lead lawyer let out an exasperated sigh. He scribbled a number on a notepad and pushed it across the table. Evelyn looked at it, then passed it to me. It was a number just shy of our original $10 million demand. It included full restitution for all lost pension and benefits for all 12 of us, a significant sum for emotional distress, and full payment of our legal fees. It was, by any measure, a total victory. Evelyn added one more condition. "The settlement will be accompanied by a public statement from the board of directors," she stated, acknowledging past errors in workforce management and committing to a full review of their HR policies. Their lawyers balked. Bryce looked up, horrified. This wasn't just about money, it was about public humiliation. But Evelyn held firm. "That part is non-negotiable," she said. "My clients need to know that this won't happen to anyone else." They folded. They had no choice. The aftermath was swift. The settlement was finalized, and the money was wired to a trust account managed by Evelyn's firm. 2 weeks later, another small article appeared in the Business Journal. Bryce Calloway had resigned as CEO of American Precision Dynamics for personal reasons. The board of directors had installed an interim CEO, a turnaround specialist known for restructuring distressed companies. The public statement we demanded was released, a mealy-mouthed piece of corporate speak that nonetheless was a clear admission of guilt. Vindication wasn't a burst of joy. It was a quiet, deep satisfaction. It was the feeling of a heavy weight being lifted, of a world that had been knocked off its axis, slowly righting itself. But the story wasn't over. The settlement money ensured that all 12 of us were financially secure. For some, it was a chance to retire in peace. For others, it was a new beginning. I was in my workshop a few weeks later when Frank and Maria came to visit. We sat around my workbench, the same place where I had felt so lost and defeated, and we talked about the future. "You know," Frank said, swirling the coffee in his mug, "that turnaround specialist they brought in? He's going to have to clean house, but he's also going to have to rebuild their supply chain and their client trust. That takes knowledge, the kind of knowledge that just walked out their door." Maria nodded in agreement. Their biggest clients are adrift. They don't trust the new management, and they're looking for stability. An idea began to form, a crazy, ambitious idea. We had the capital from the settlement, we had the knowledge, we had the relationships, and we had the talent. Marcus and the other 2 engineers who had quit were looking for work. "What if," I said slowly, "we stopped letting other people define our value? What if we built something for ourselves?" And so Abernathy Strategic Solutions was born. We named it in honor of the old founder, as a tribute to a time when people mattered. We pooled a portion of our settlement money and leased a small, modest office space not 5 miles from the APD plant. I was the lead consultant for systems and engineering. Frank ran finance and operations. Maria handled client relations and logistics. We hired Marcus and the other 2 engineers as our core technical team. We were a small, lean, experienced team of redundancies. Our first client came before we even had our sign on the door. It was the medical device company, the one whose procurement head was Maria's friend. He called her mobile number. "I heard you guys started a consulting firm," he said. "We've officially terminated our contract with APD. We need a new partner who understands our needs. When can you start?" "I'm sitting in our new office now. It's not fancy, but it's ours." The whiteboard behind me is covered in my familiar scrawl, sketching out a process flow for a new client. Frank is on the phone, calmly explaining a complex financial model. Maria is laughing with Marcus over a set of blueprints. The air is filled with the quiet hum of productive, respectful work. There is no synergy. There is only competence. They thought my loyalty was a chain they could yank whenever they wanted, a leash that kept me in my place. They never understood that loyalty, the kind that's built over decades, isn't a chain, it's a foundation. It's the bedrock you build a company on. And when you carelessly blast it away to save a few dollars, you shouldn't be surprised when the whole structure comes crashing down around you. They mistook my quiet nature for weakness, my experience for an expense. They failed to understand a fundamental truth of business and of life. Your value is not determined by the person who signs your paycheck. It's determined by your skill, your integrity, and the trust you have built, brick by brick, over the course of a career. They can take your job, but they can't take your value. That belongs to you. And in the end, true competence will always find its market. They learned that lesson the hard way. They forgot that competence isn't cheap until you lose it. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or erased in your own career, give this video a like. It helps more people find these stories. Share it with someone who might need to be reminded of their own worth. And please tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because there are always more stories of competence winning in the end. And believe me, it always does.